Welcome to Aspire's webinar, Reflect, Renew, Rewrite, Analyzing Your Website Through an Ethical Lens. Please introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us your name, where you work, and where you are based. I'm Naomi Lipstein. I work for Olam, and I'm based in Israel. I'm really pleased you can all join us to explore this topic that, as Olam's communication manager, holds particular significance for me. Over the next hour, we'll be taking a deep dive into how you can assess whether your website accurately reflects your organization's commitment to ethical practices in international development. And if not, what you can do about it. We'll then break up into peer groups for a workshop session and come back together after that for another 25 minutes or so of workshop feedback and questions and answers. This topic is especially relevant during this period between the Jewish New Year, Rosh Hashanah, and Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. Known on the Jewish calendar as the 10 Days of Repentance or 10 Days of Awe, it's generally a time when we reflect upon our past actions and on how we can do better. I want to emphasize this period of time, and certainly this webinar, is not about berating yourself for mistakes, but about taking a realistic and critical look at where there's room for improvement, in this case, on your own digital landscape. Before we get to that, I'd like to briefly introduce Aspire for those of you who are not familiar with it. There's going to be a link in the chat, or there already is, so you can go to a page to learn more about Aspire. But in a nutshell, Aspire is an Olam program that provides tools to deepen your organization's ethical practices in 5 areas: climate, communications, community engagement, global service, and monitoring and evaluation. We offer useful resources, webinars such as this one, micro grants for Olam partners, and ethical practices spectrums that pinpoint stages along a continuum of ethical practices. These allow you to identify where you are on the spectrum and actions you can take to progress. You can also get involved in Aspire peer groups, where you can discuss ethical challenges and solutions with a smaller group. We'll put a link in the chat now to sign up for a peer group on any one of the topics I mentioned. And finally, you can already mark your calendars for the next webinar, December 6th, Preparing for the Future, Climate Resilience and Adaptation of Local Communities. We'll discuss how to assess long-term needs and build adaptive capacity of individuals and communities to adjust behaviors, practices, lifestyles, and livelihood strategies in response to climate impact. This is for anyone who works in international development, whether or not your programs focus on climate, because climate change will inevitably affect the lives of the communities you work with. Again, there's a link in the chat, so you can already sign up for that. I just mentioned our Aspire spectrum. Each one includes 10 commandments, or in essence, key guidelines for that topic. While our webinars usually focus on just one commandment, this workshop is a bit unusual in that because your website is your organization's vehicle for telling your audiences everything about your organization, today we're going to focus on assessing your website for adherence to all 10 commandments. Of course, time doesn't allow us to go into depth about all of them, but I will review the headlines, and our speaker, Mariam, will delve a little deeper into some of them. But I strongly encourage everyone to read through the spectrum, which explains each commandment. We're putting that link in the chat now. I also encourage you to review our ethical communications resources, many of which refer to one commandment or another. Again, that link we are putting into the chat. And we will be sending out all of these links after the webinar, so you don't have to worry about getting them all now. Before we begin, I'll note that while we're focusing on websites, each of these rules apply to social media as well, and really to all your communications materials. Now we're going to take a quick look at the 10 commandments in our ethical practices spectrum. 1, have and implement a written ethical communications policy, which you can actually put on your website. Get informed consent from those you are featuring in photos or stories. Do not put anyone at risk by featuring them. Ensure all the information on your website is accurate, and make sure you include members of local communities you're working with when developing your messaging about them. Make sure your messaging gives context and avoids stereotypes, that it's focused on community members and avoids saviorism language, that it preserves their dignity and doesn't use so-called poverty porn. We'll get into these concepts a little deeper in a moment. that you choose the language you use carefully, and finally, that your website, your social media, and all your communications materials are accessible to people with disabilities. I am now so pleased to introduce Mariam Mohsin, who is not only head of media and communications for Bond in the UK, but was also on the steering committee that put together our communication spectrum and these 10 commandments. Mariam?
Hi, thank you so much for having me, and Happy New Year, everyone, as well. It's lovely to see so many of you turn out. I am also in a very rainy London, so I'm hoping that you won't be able to hear the background noise of downpour. But yes, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm going to share my presentation with you all. So let's do the technical stuff, share screen. This will stop others from, yeah, that's fine. Yes. Me. There we go. Right. So let's get into it. So this is very much going to be a session looking at the practicalities around looking at kind of why websites should be ethical and also how you can make it happen, and just breaking down what this looks like in practice. This is quite a substantive topic, so we're not going to be able to go into everything in lots of detail, but the PowerPoint's going to be shared with all of you after this session, and you are more than welcome to drop me a message if you have any questions or anything that you're unsure about. Similar to Naomi, this is an issue that's really dear to my heart, so I'm always keen to help as many organizations really crack this and figure out how to make it happen in practice. So this is what we're going to be doing today. We are going to have a quick kind of chat around why do website ethics matter, so we can really ground this issue and have a shared understanding of why this is important. I'm going to do a very quick survey with you all just to get a sense of where your organizations are on this issue. We're going to go through a few key concepts to again just boost your understanding and knowledge base. Lots of you will have your own knowledge about this, so it's really helpful just to share where we all are and what are some of the key concepts and ideas that really ground this subject. Then we're going to start applying those concepts into practice. So looking at building a checklist. So this is getting the practical nitty gritty of how do we actually make this happen in practice. And there's going to be a list of helpful resources at the end of the presentation as well. And then we're going to do a practical exercise where I want you all to think about some of the questions that are being unearthed during the session and have a look at your own pages. So pick a page from one of your organization's website, and then we'll do a quick audit so you can see what this feels like in practice and some of the questions it throws up. And then at the end of the session, it'll be good to have a conversation about your reflections, what the implications are, and then you're more than welcome to ask me any questions as well. Right, do put any of your questions or your comments in the chat. I'm not going to be able to see them, but my lovely colleagues, Naomi and Alison, will flag anything to me so we can pick them up as we go along. So, firstly, I would like to hear from you all. Just drop your thoughts in the chat. Why do you think that we should take an ethical approach to our websites? So have a think about your audiences, have a think about the work that you do, but why do you think website ethics, content ethics, image ethics, accessibility, why do all of these things matter? Oh, excellent. Don't be shy. Oh, really good comments. Yep. Brilliant. So got a comment in there about preserving the dignity of community members to make sure a wide range of people can access our resources and protecting dignity. Brilliant. Excellent. Yes, websites are very much your shop window to your organization. So these are all excellent comments. I'm going to go through some of the ideas that I've captured and why I think this really matters. Oh, hopefully I'm going to go. There we go. So respect. So you've mentioned this yourselves. You know, this is very much an opportunity for us to make sure that we're being respectful towards the communities that we support, but also the colleagues that we work with around the world. It's really important for us to show solid representation of the communities that we work with, but also take an ethical approach to storytelling. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next few slides. But this is very much about taking a people-based approach to storytelling. It means that people also with disabilities will have access to our content and be able to kind of engage with what it is that we're doing and can see themselves in the stories that we're telling. It's also important to get informed consent. So, sorry, I've done these wrong way around, but anyway, it's important to get informed consent from people that we're working with. So especially when we're talking about images and stories, making sure that we are practicing, taking steps towards good practice to make sure that people that we're using their images know exactly how we're using the pictures that we're taking and what we're using them for. Safeguarding, incredibly important. I know many of you all remember the crisis. Well, I don't know whether you all remember, but in the UK, we remember very starkly the crisis that hit the organisations in the UK NGO sector, and where there were real questions around safeguarding and exploitation. And one of the key components of that is also about how we're capturing images of vulnerable communities, particularly children as well. And also, it's just good to set a good example. So Bond, the organisation that I work with, is a membership-based organisation. So for us and our members, we really do encourage everyone to set the bar high when it comes to how we're working and the policies and practices that we're adhering to. And also the law. So there are guidelines and pieces of legislation within the UK that we as Bond have signed up to. So things like compliance when it comes to people's data, but also best practice. So Bond as an organisation has signed something called Pledge for Change, which is very much about representational communications and being ethical in our approach. But I'm more than happy to share a link to that kind of process and that agenda going forwards. But I know Alarm's been doing so much work about this, so that they've really set the bar high as well for member organisations about what it is we should all be aspiring to achieve and do, and the ways that we should be working. So it is now Mentimeter time. So this is very much about finding out what's the baseline across everyone that's here today. So it's a really simple question. The Mentimeter link is going to be in the chat, and there's a code right there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to show my screen, which has the Mentimeter, and just to show how people are kind of marking their responses. But in a nutshell, the question is, does your organisation have a checklist of things that you need to consider before anything is published on your website? So it's a real practical question. Like, do you have this process in place? And there's no judgment here at all. It just gives me a sense of whether this is a conversation or a process that takes place within your organisations right now. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing this screen. Oh gosh, you can all see me. And I'm going to start sharing my other screen. Bear with me. Here we go. Ah, excellent. I can see lots of you already sharing your responses. Okay, so it's helpful to see where you all are as organisations, and it's obviously a mixed bag. But it's helpful to get a sense of where you all are. It's one of those things where sometimes it sits within the comms team, so not everyone across the organisation will know about what these processes are unless they are uploading content themselves, because some organisations are quite democratic about how they do these things. But it's important that everyone should know what the process is and what this checklist that we're going to talk about should look like in practice. So what we are going to do now is I'm going to stop sharing this screen, and I'm going to start sharing a different screen, which is back to the presentation. Here we go. This is fantastic multitasking, if I do say so myself, of myself. Right, here we go. So these are the key concepts that we think it's really important for organisations to be aware of when they're thinking about images and text online. So we've mentioned some of them already, but we're going to go into them just a little bit deeper. So informed consent. The idea behind this is that there needs to be permission granted for anyone that's basically had their image captured, but also potentially the stories that have been captured as well. And this is the idea that they have full knowledge of when, where, how, and for what purpose their image is being used. With the understanding that they can say no without there being any consequence. And this is why translating informed consent forms and having that very kind of open conversation with whoever it is that you're looking to capture a picture of is so important. Harmful narratives is a really important notion as well, and it's cropping up much more in communication circles as something that we really need to address, particularly within the context of localization, which I'll come to in a second. But the idea,
Mariam, I'm just going to interrupt. Sorry, I'm going to interrupt for one moment
that's all right, go for it.
You're not sharing your PowerPoint if you mean to be sharing.
I do. Sorry. Where are we? Here we go. Bad multitasking of Mariam. It appears. I'm just congratulating myself and then classic.
You're doing good.
Shot myself in the foot. There we go. Is that better? Perfect. Right. There we go. I was wondering why I couldn't see you all of a sudden. Right. There we go. Right. Back on track. So where did I get up to? Harmful narratives. So hopefully lots of you will have heard about locally led development, localization, community-led storytelling, but we'll have a bit more of a deeper conversation about that in a moment. But in a nutshell, it's this idea that we are telling stories that are perpetuating particular narratives about the communities that we work with, but even parts of the world. So, you know, this idea that in Africa or, you know, in kind of lower income countries like Pakistan or Afghanistan, people are just there waiting for us to come and save them. And, you know, aren't they so grateful and lucky that we're there? It's this idea that we are saviors somehow and they are just passive recipients. Whereas the truth is we know that local communities are all often the first responders. And yet this truth is not necessarily represented in a lot of the communications that we potentially put out. So it's questioning some of these narratives that we're perpetuating, often with good intentions, but there's harm that's happening there because we're creating a particular picture about a part of the world that might not necessarily be accurate. And, you know, at best, but at worst, it can be damaging as well. If we also take localization, so this is very much the idea of putting local organizations, local partners that we work with, local government actors in the driving seat of storytelling, you know, local government as and when it's appropriate. But it's this idea that you're speaking to local experts, local people that are actually often much more knowledgeable about what the solutions are, what the issues are, but also we're so used to translating problems from the community, NGOs are the spokespeople, or an NGO CEO is the person that we'll put forward for an interview. It's about passing that mic or passing that lens so that we're actually giving the communities that we work with much more control over their own narrative. And we're seeing this also, this idea applied to programming or funding. So more resources are pushed to local communities, therefore more power is pushed to local communities via local partners. If we think about also the security of people featured, so this is a really important idea that we should always do no harm. And it's, you know, it's a classic humanitarian principle, but there is a comms website ethics element to this, which I'm sure many of you will know and be very familiar with. But it's basic things like making sure that we're not revealing too much information and making sure that we're protecting people that are vulnerable in different situations so that we're not unintentionally putting them in a position of harm. If we take saviorism, so this builds on what I was talking about with localization, but also harmful narratives, it's the classic, you know, comic relief, questionable, from back in the era of the 80s. I mean, lots of organizations have done exactly the same thing. So this is not just particular to comic relief at all. But in a way, the reason why that springs to mind is there have been a number of occasions where celebrities have been used to do fundraising appeals, and there'll be pictures of them holding a child. And there's a questionable dynamic there and a very questionable ethical approach there about, is this the most appropriate way of depicting what's happening in other countries, but also the work that we're doing in other countries to try and support people. Disability and discrimination and or accessibility, you know, this is another key component that we really need to make sure that we're addressing. You know, our website content should be accessible to anyone, you know, with whatever disability they have. We should be making steps towards making sure that happen and trying our best in that direction. And there are lots of tools and resources that are out there that sometimes people aren't aware of, or there are some basic techniques that people don't necessarily know about or think about. Racial justice, treating people equally and fairly, representation of everyone regardless of ethnicity and race, really important. And this is such an important way of making sure that we achieve racial justice. You know, if we're actively making sure that we're not discriminating against, even if it's unintentional, people that we're also supporting, because we may think, oh, actually, you know, it's that image of the child, that's the thing that we know is going to bring people in. You know, we've got to make sure that we're representing the truth and the realities of what's happening in the various places that we work in. So these are just the key concepts that really underpin a lot of what we're talking about. Accuracy and transparency as well is a really important one. So this is the basics of making sure that we're, you know, meeting our charity obligations. So we have something called the Charity Commission in the UK, which basically makes sure that we're adhering to transparency standards about impact, you know, our accounting reports, our annual reports demonstrating where we're getting funding from, you know, what projects are we working on, you know, how are we tackling safeguarding, all of these things, being transparent also about how you're using data. These are things that we should all just be doing, often from a legal perspective, but it's also just good practice. It's the right thing to do. So I've whistled through this, but it'll sink in and we'll be coming back to the same themes and the same ideas over and over again. So we'll get familiar with these ideas if this is the first time you're really thinking about this. So we're going to do a bit of an exercise now. So I have borrowed this excellent set of images from an organization called Radi8. And they're worth Googling. They've done a lot of work looking at ethical images and representation, but also importantly, they've done a lot of research to back up some of the messages and the agenda that they're basically trying to push, which is about making sure that we're questioning and asking the right questions and thinking about why we're doing what we're doing and how we're doing it, nodding to all of the points that I've just kind of indicated as themes. So these are the three images I've captured. I'm going to ask you to just pop some comments in the chat. But in a nutshell, all of these images are part of the same fundraising appeal. So this was a test campaign. So it wasn't something that actually happened in real life. But what this organization was trying to do is they wanted to check with communities across different parts of Africa to ask, how do they feel and what do they think about the images that are typically used by organizations, NGOs, particularly in the West? And so it's a really interesting piece of research. I would really highly recommend you all have a look at it. And just to be really clear, there are no wrong and right answers to this question. This is just about seeing how you think and what your logic would be behind each of these images if you were going to pick one. And basically, in a nutshell, what these images are trying to do is it's a fundraising campaign for a water and sanitation project. So you can see from the text, you know, you've got kind of one child looking happy, another one looking a bit more neutral, another one looking sad, and then the text is pretty much the same on each one. So the question is, you know, which image would you use if you were going to do a fundraising appeal with your organization? Which picture would you think would be the most appropriate for what it is that you're trying to communicate, and also the audience that you're trying to reach, but also the community that you're also representing through this campaign? And it would just be good to get some of your thoughts and reflections in the chat. Let's see. Either neutral. Interesting. So from Naomi, either neutral or sad works. The one with a happy child seems inappropriate considering the message. I would use the neutral one. The middle image. Really interesting and helpful, and do continue just to share your reflections. So in a way, this is how I would often approach this. So I often think that context and appropriateness is key. So you can't forget about the message that you're trying to communicate to your audience, you know, and ultimately there's something about if you've got a happy child, but you're actually trying to communicate something that's quite serious, it doesn't work. You know, those are two opposing messages that you're pushing out to an audience. For me, the other thing I'd say is there's nothing wrong with showing that things are terrible, but it's often about how you do it and the ethics that you've used to take that approach. So I often take issue with just having a child by themselves and not showing, parents or, somebody that's taking responsibility for that child, because I think you're showing a very particular context, you're showing a very particular image, and you're removing actually the fact that they do have somebody there that's supporting them. Whereas if you're showing them by themselves, you're suggesting, oh, they're by themselves and there's nobody there to help them. So I think there's something in there about making sure whatever image you're using, you're showing the context and it's appropriate for what it is that you're trying to communicate. But I'm not somebody that thinks, and this just wouldn't necessarily work, but you shouldn't work with children. I think if you're following your appropriate consent processes and procedures, there is nothing wrong with showing children in images. It's about the process and the ethics that you use. But I think when you're thinking about the images that you use, it's about the context as well. The image shouldn't be shown in isolation, especially if it's a child, if there is family around them, because I think context is really, really important. And that's a more honest depiction of what's happening there. So it's often about the how and the intention, not just the what you're doing. So really, really fantastically helpful to get your comments and reflections. And, that's mirrored a lot of the thinking and discussions that I've had with colleagues about these 3 pictures as well. Let's go to the next slide. There we go. So we're going to drill in a little bit deeper into just 3 areas that I think are really, really important, but we'll end up touching on everything at some point throughout this session. So when it comes to images, this is a really useful tool, because what it does is it basically has a checklist. These are the types of things that you should be asking yourself and thinking about when you're picking the images that you use. And I won't go through all of them just because I don't have enough time, unfortunately, but I'm going to pick out a few things that the checklist doesn't necessarily mention, but I think it's really important to note. So captions are so important. Not only does it help, not only just describe what's actually happening in the image, but if you are a person with a disability, and you are using an image reader, what that will do is it will tell this person that might not be able to see the image what the image actually is by just giving a description. So your caption is so important with every image. Sometimes people forget to give captions, or they think, oh, but it doesn't quite work with the design of my website. But it's so important to think that if you don't have a caption, somebody's not going to necessarily know what that image is, and you're basically excluding them from that really important piece of content. I'm also a big believer in giving credit to photographers. Freelancers, this is their livelihood, it's their image. I mean, there are laws around this as well, where you can't actually, use images if you're not giving credit to the photographer, not following due process. But it's really important to give credit to the person who's taken that picture, whether it's an individual or an organization, but use whatever it is that they're asking you to use. Again, really important not to reveal information that means that, a child or a vulnerable community or a family are easy to locate. So the rule, I used to work at an organization that focused on child marriage and protecting young girls from child marriage. And we would know by looking at our search engine that there were some very unsavory characters that were searching for particular things on our website. So it really did hit home this idea that you've got to be so careful about the information that you share in captions, and even in blogs or any kind of storytelling content, about where this individual is and who they are. So I would always say give very top line information. If they're a vulnerable person, always offer to change their name. But it might be actually appropriate not even to use that image if they are that vulnerable, and if it's, if they're in a really risky situation. But what I would always suggest is keep it as top line as possible. Don't bother going into the district or the exact area that they live in. Maybe just say the country or roughly where in the West, or, mention a region, but don't be too specific is what I'd highly recommend. And never use first name and surname or anything like that. So these are just top line things, but do have a look at more information online about what kind of information it's appropriate to share and not share about individuals that you're capturing. Because safeguarding and security is so important, especially when you're dealing with children, people with disabilities as well. And just finally, I've said this already, but just to reiterate, it's not unethical to use images of children. So I've heard lots of organizations say, we're not going to use pictures of children anymore, because even though they're the main, kind of stakeholder or person that they try to support, and it's just not necessarily a reasonable ask for all organizations. So you've got to make a judgment about what makes sense for you, and just make sure that you're doing your best in terms of ethics, but also you're adhering to safeguarding rules and regulations and policies. And obviously have a look at Olam's ethical communications guide. I'm not just saying it because I worked on it, but it is really, really good. It's so comprehensive and thorough. Yeah, and it's a beast of a piece of work as well. We put so much time and thought into it. I do feel like it's one of the most comprehensive things that exists that can just help you get things right when it comes to ethical communications. Right, let's go on to ethical language and storytelling. So this is another key concept that we spoke about a little bit, well, that I mentioned a little bit earlier. But in a nutshell, this is just capturing, once again, some of the key points that it's really important to have a think about. And there are lots of resources that speak to this. And, needless to say, language and storytelling are intrinsically linked. They are not separate at all. And I've done lots of work writing about the importance of ethical language. For example, just last week, I hosted a session with a bunch of journalists here in the UK, because lots of them didn't even realise that there is a shift amongst lots of organisations in the UK towards using more appropriate language and better forms of representation. So I'll give a very quick example. So there was a newspaper that used a very inappropriate image accompanying a piece all about decolonizing, the UK aid sector. And the piece went out, it was published, and then the NGO said to the journalist, why have you used that image? Because it totally undermines our whole argument in the article. But their response was, we didn't know. It's the picture desk that picks the image as opposed to us as a journalist. I'll see what I can do to fix it. So in a way, it just speaks to this idea that it's really important to make sure that everyone that you're communicating with knows where you are on this journey. So if you're being intentional about the language that you use, signpost it to journalists in your press release and your notes to editors. That's just a side note, but that's something that I learned over the past few days, that it's really important to think about that. Right, let's get back to ethical storytelling. So in a nutshell, this is very much about passing the mic. So it's about making sure that at any opportunity you can, and there are going to be contexts where this just doesn't work necessarily, especially if you're in a humanitarian context. Very hard to say to somebody, hi, I know that you're facing this extreme emergency. Can you just give me a bit of your time to tell me what's going on? There's a question in there about appropriateness. And if it's not right to do it then take a step back. But wherever you can, the aim should always be to let people speak on behalf of themselves. If they have the opportunity to tell things in their own voice, inevitably the audience that you're speaking to is going to get a far better understanding of their perspective, what it is that's happening to them, what the issues are, in a very human way that they probably can connect with much better than if you've got kind of an interlocutor that is doing the interpretation for them. So highly recommend and would suggest that we take this approach to storytelling going forward. There's something in there as well about challenging stereotypes. So, the white savior approach to humanitarian delivery, when we know that actually it's local communities that are the first responders. So let's actively try and challenge this narrative that we have over time unintentionally contributed to. Now that we know that this has happened, let's actively try and dismantle it and address that stereotype that we've helped build by just changing our approach to how we're telling stories and how we're describing things. Honesty, accuracy, and truthfulness, these are really obvious things, but there's something in there about making sure that we're using solid data, and we're not necessarily misrepresenting what's going on in order to boost our fundraising appeals. And not saying that we all do this, but there's always an incentive to make things look as terrible as they possibly can be in order to get people to give as much as they can. And even though fundraising is significantly important, it's got to be done in an accurate and ethical way. I won't go into all of them, but basically that's just a solid list of things just to think about when you're reflecting on what ethical storytelling actually looks like in practice. Ethical language. So Bond's worked on a language guide. I've written lots of blogs about this as well, which you're more than welcome to read. But the crux of it is, whatever language we're using, it's got to mirror our organizational values. So it's obvious things, but at the same time, when things feel very normal, you don't always question them in the way that you should. So for example, Bond no longer uses words like beneficiaries. We never use foreign aid or just aid. We don't say poor people because it doesn't really explain why people are poor. So we always try to give context to the situation that people and communities are actually in. So, why is it that they don't have access to clean water and sanitation? Why is it that they've had to flee their home in, Libya or Morocco? Like, what is it that's driving the challenges and issues that are putting people in the situations that they're in? Just to, again, give context and make it much more human and take away some of the biases that our right-leaning press often kind of hark on about. Very keen to make sure that our language is as jargon-free as possible. So actually, a criticism that I often get from journalists is, well, it's all very well you saying that we should be using better and more accurate and ethical language. You all use so much jargon as a sector that we're often having to translate what you're saying to the people that we're speaking to. And it's a really, really fair criticism. And, I'm sure health sectors in the countries that you're in are much better at explaining very complicated health issues to the general public than we are, about things that are actually so normal, like, getting your child into a school, making sure they're receiving quality education, having access to, basic medication and healthcare. Like, these are all things that are actually so relatable because we all face these challenges. But the issue is it's on another level when you're thinking about some of the countries that we're working in. So it's really important just to boil it down to what it is that we're actually talking about and not make our sector overly scientific, because we don't really need to and we shouldn't. So for the UK, this is really important, and I don't know how much it will relate to a different context, but I'll just touch on it. So there's a lot of politicized language that exists in the UK. So things like global Britain and, Britain being a superpower in international development. There are lots of phrases that are bandied about that aren't necessarily backed up by fact or substance, but it's a way of us inflating our own egos as a country that's perpetuated by particular governments. And what we've committed to do is just not buy into that. So if we are leading something, so the UK's done lots of brilliant work on vaccinations and education with girls, then fair enough, because there's enough evidence to say that's a fair point. But when we're describing ourselves as a superpower, which just simply isn't true anymore. We've cut the UK aid budget by such a huge amount. It's 0.5, it used to be 0.7. We can't really claim that we are, but also it harks back to a very colonial mentality that we are somehow dominating, all of our competitors in the world when it comes to this. And there needs to be a little bit of self-awareness and humbleness in how we're talking about what we're doing here, because of the nature of what we're talking about, if nothing else. Okay, so what I'm going to go into is just one more thing that I'll go into a little bit more detail, and then we'll get into the practical nitty-gritty. So accessibility. There's a lot of information about accessibility that I would encourage you to go and have a look at some of the links at the end of this session. But in a nutshell, some of it kind of seems obvious, but people don't necessarily have the opportunity to think about it. So for example, I'm guilty of this. Before I came into the sector, I would never have thought, oh, I should really not use, yellow text against a white background, because people that have visual impairments are really going to struggle to read what it is that I've written on this screen. But it's only when you realize what this feels and looks like for somebody who does have visual impairment, or who does need particular requirements when it comes to accessibility, you realize actually how many barriers there are in front of people just to do basic things like access your content. So here are a few things that I've just listed that are really important. So I won't go through all of them, but things like, if you've got a piece of video content, give them the opportunity to translate that content into written text, because that's a really important tool that a lot of people rely on. And when you're thinking about designing a website, think about design principles. So what size should your font be? You know, what should the structure of your website page look like, so that somebody can easily go between different sections and understand what the structure of your page is, because it just helps them understand and interpret the information that's on there. Give people alternative ways of consuming your content. So, you know, not everyone can always afford to do this. So always look at the most cost-effective way of doing this. But if there's a chance of having, you know, image, caption, text, maybe a bit of video, it just gives people different options to be able to digest your content. But it has to be obviously whatever's manageable for you and your organization. But it's this idea that you're actively trying to cater for people that have different needs. And also, you know, flashing content's a really important one, because, you know, people, it can trigger seizures, you know, so often you'll see a warning when you're watching particular pieces of content where there's flashing lights. It's in order to make sure that people are aware that actually, if that's going to trigger a seizure, they need to look away. So make sure you just don't use it. We don't need to use it on our websites. It's unnecessary. Whereas, you know, on the TV, sometimes they have no choice. So, but I would always say, just don't do it because you don't need to. And again, I mean, in a way, let's kill two birds with one stone. You know, technical jargon, regional slang, it's inaccessible language, full stop. But actually, it's a barrier for people with disabilities. If they're reading your content with an image reader or a text reader, and there's jargon in there that they just don't understand, again, it means you've put a barrier between them and them being able to access your content. So, and these are just a few things that it's really helpful to think about that you might not necessarily think about automatically. I mean, things like typos, links, are they working? It's so important to check them, because could you imagine if, you know, you click a link and you can't see that it's not actually worked, but then there's no text on the page to say that, you know, this page isn't working, or this link is broken, I'm really sorry, or something like polite like that, just so somebody understands what's actually happened there, because if you can't see it, you won't necessarily know. And just to flag, there are lots of different tools that are available. So this thing called the instant eyedropper, and what that does is it basically just looks at the colors that you've used on your website and tells you, you know, actually how it's performing for somebody that has accessibility needs. So there are lots of tools and resources that are out there that are free. But it's worth just running some of your content through those tools just to see where you are as a baseline. And are there small adjustments and tweaks that you could make to make somebody's experience of using your website a much more, you know, like a nicer one, basically, but also, you know, a fairer one as well. So I'm definitely not going to go through all of this with you, but I wanted to take some of the effort and thinking, because sometimes this can be quite hard to get your head around, and not everyone has all the time in the world. And also it's sometimes helpful for somebody else just to do a bit of the legwork for you. So what I've done is I've just categorized all of the things that I think it's useful for you all to have a think about when you're working on your website or when you're reviewing your website. So that you've got a handy checklist all in one place. Now, there are going to be things that I have inevitably missed, or things that are very context specific to your organization. But I think this is a really good starting point, and it's about as comprehensive as I could make it. So have a look at this in your own time, because it basically just lists each of the main kind of areas that are important to think about, and what are the key things that you need to be questioning or looking for under each of those categories when you're looking at your website. I'm going to just pick out a couple that I haven't had a chance to drill down into, but I think it's just worth flagging. So GDPR compliance, which is known in the UK as General Data Protection Regulation. So this is one of those things where I remember the days when we had to make sure our websites were GDPR compliant, because a piece of law was coming into going to be coming into action, and like, bless my membership colleague, you know, because we hold so much data about all of our members and organizations, you know, and we were one of those organizations that was guilty of having lots of information on Excel spreadsheets. No more, it's all in Salesforce, it's all protected, nobody has access to this information, it's all safe and secure. Because the point is, if somebody has given you this information, you need to be trusted with it. And we are very transparent on our website in terms of setting out how information is collected, how we store it, what we do with it. And we give our audiences the opportunity to opt out as well. And I think that's, again, really important, because you can't impose the collection of data on anyone. People need to be open to it and are happy with the fact that it's taking place, but they need to trust you as an organization and know that you are not going to be doing anything with it that's going to mean that it's unsafe. So just to pick up on that, yeah, and I'm more than happy to share a link to what that page looks like. If you're not sure where to start, you can have a look at how we've done it, and it's pretty comprehensive, but it's a really good one to think about. Okay, right, so I know I've bombarded you with a lot of information, but hopefully it'll all make sense soon enough when you start thinking about some of this in practice. So what I've done is I've just worked through, with lots of helpful advice from lovely Naomi as well, what are the practical steps that we need to go through in order to basically be able to try and address some of the issues that I've just spoken about, to make sure that our website content is as ethical as it can be, it's as accessible as it can be. We're making sure that we're kind of leaning into really important issues like racial justice and locally led development, and making sure that we're taking an ethical approach to images and we're adhering to safeguarding. Like, how do we do this in practice? Because it can be a minefield, and often I always find that starting is always the hardest thing. But what we've done is we've broken it down into just some manageable steps for you. So in a nutshell, what we suggest you do is take some time just to create a spreadsheet. I love an Excel spreadsheet, to just list some of the pages that you are going to look at one at a time. I would always suggest going to the pages where you have probably the most traffic or the most sensitive information. I think that's a good approach to these things. But ultimately, at some point, you want to go through the bulk of your website, but this can take time. So don't think, oh, I'm going to do all of this in the space of 1 month. It's just not going to happen. Make it manageable for you as an organization. And depending on how many members of staff you've got that can dedicate some time to this, but it is really, really worth doing and really important. So I'd encourage you to put this into practice when you can. So go through each of the pages and just have a list of questions that you want to ask for each of those subject areas, and think about some of the things that I've mentioned. You can use the checklist that I've pulled together in the previous slide, or you may have your own that you need to think about as well that I'm not aware of. So I don't work for a fundraising organization, so in a way my lens is very much about a membership-based organization lens. So I can imagine for an organization that's fundraising for the public, the types of things that you're going to need to think about are going to be quite different. So just bear that in mind as well. So think through the questions that you want to ask. Document your work. I'm going to show you an example of something that I've pulled together, that's quite a tangible way of processing it, and you're more than welcome to use that as a template. But log what you're doing and why you're doing it, and when you reviewed it. So dating things is also really important, so that whoever picks up this piece of work in the future, or if you pick up this piece of work in the future, this is the last time I checked this page. Since then, 6 months or a year may have gone by. I need to make sure I go back and check that any information that could have been uploaded, hopefully in that space of time, what you will have done is you'll have a process that you're going to follow to make sure that anything you've uploaded kind of adhere to all of these rules. But if you're checking your website because somebody else has added content, it's a good opportunity just to make sure you're sticking to the principles and the way you want, and your checklist in a thorough and comprehensive way. So this is just a good way of keeping you on track. And set a review date. It's so important because, these things are cyclical, it's not linear, and it just means that there's just no moment where something's going to fall through the gaps unintentionally. So this is what I've pulled together. So we're actually using this because it's a really useful resource. So our About Us page, I'll confess to you, it hasn't been looked at for something like 3 years. which is, don't tell anyone, but that's the truth of it. We all know how ridiculously busy, and I'm not going to pretend we get things right either as an organization. We're going through our own journey with this, and it's important to own that. But what we're doing is we're going to go through our About Us pages, because there are lots of things that have changed since 3 years ago. So, for example, you know, our language guide was developed 2 years ago. So we've not gone through the process of sifting through that page to check whether it adheres to our language guide, which is about not using kind of colonial language or politicized language. You know, it's good to look at the images that we've got on that page. So, for example, when we put the picture of the banner, so we always like to have a picture of all of our members. I can imagine 3 years ago, we wouldn't necessarily have thought, does this look like a diverse picture? You know, like, do we have a mixture of all of the different members that we represent? You know, we have lots of members that are small organizations, that are faith-based organizations, you know, that are organizations that focus on disability. Like, am I showing an accurate picture of who we are as an organization, but also am I showing representation? Because our members are diverse, so they need to be represented in that way. Like working links. So you can imagine over 3 years, you know what it's like. Documents move from one place to another, links break and nobody knows why. It's just really good practice to check that things are still working in the way that they need to. On our About Us page, we've got a lot of our annual report information. So just checking that all of those links are also working and everything on there is up to date and current. You know, consent and safeguarding, also really important. We don't have any images on that page that are of any particular communities that are vulnerable or anything along those lines, but still, it's important to just make sure that that is still true over the space of 3 years. And I've mentioned the diversity and credit. So, and what you can see is I've got the link there, so everyone knows the page that I'm referring to. I've got my date of when I'm going to check it. I've already told myself I'm going to check it again, you know, next year, early next year. 6 months will have gone by because I don't want to leave it too late. And also, we're doing a whole bunch of rebranding. So that page will change. I know it will. So I need to make sure we stay on top of that. And my categories are, you know, what's been reviewed, what's been updated or changed, and, you know, what are the tweaks that I've made, but also saying what change was made so that I've got almost a memory of what it was that I've done on that page historically, because it's just good to have this information just to track what it is that you're doing with your websites and how they're evolving, so that you know that you've actually been through this process and you've not missed anything, or if you have, you can log it the following year, because things evolve. You know, our language guide's going to evolve over time. You know, the way you approach your images potentially going to evolve. So you're not necessarily always going to see that page in the same way now as you will in, you know, 6 months' time, a year's time, 3 years' time, because as a sector, our thinking on a lot of these issues is changing, legislation's changing. So it's important to be alive and alert to making sure that our websites evolve with us as organizations. Okay, so this is the fun bit, because I get to sneak in and out of all of your breakout groups. But what I want you to do is I want you just to take the opportunity to go through one of your website pages with a group of your colleagues or group of people within your breakout groups. You are more than welcome to use this list of questions. You may have questions that you want to add to this list. Yeah, but you're more than welcome to use this as a starting point, and this list of questions is going to be posted in the chat. So don't worry about the classic thing where you go into a group and you're like, what's the instruction again? Because that information is going to be in your group. But what I want you to do is just have a go. So there's no right or wrong. We're all learning here and figuring things out, but just test this out on one of your pages and just see where you get to on this list of questions. Because it's good just to practice. Sometimes it's just about exercising that muscle and seeing how this looks and feels. So what we're going to do is we're going to split you into 2 groups, and we are going to let you go through the questions, And then I'm going to dip in and out because I like hearing about how conversations are kind of evolving, and if there are any sticking points as well, I'd like to be on hand to be able to support you through this process. And then you've got 10 minutes. After that, we'll come back into plenary, and then we can just do some of our reflections, and you're more than welcome to ask me any questions, so I can help support you as well. And just very quickly as well, just to remind you, if you're an Olam partner, do use the Aspire Micro grant. So you can hire a consultant using that grant that can help you with this as well. So just to flag that there is this resource that exists for you if you are a member, a partner of Olam. And you can purchase some software to help you check accessibility. You can hire a consultant to support you. There's lots of different things you can do. And just to give you a bit more information, so prices will often range from about $400 to $1,000, depending on what kind of visitors, what type of visiting numbers you're getting to your website. But we can go into that in a little bit more detail in the Q&A afterwards. But I just wanted to flag that there is a resource there that exists for you if you are an Olam partner. Right, are we ready? Well, I joined the smaller group because I felt bad that there was a smaller group. So I didn't get the opportunity to join the other group. But I'd be really keen to get your thoughts and reflections off the back of that. I mean, how did people find that exercise?
I found it
I
very
can see
helpful.
you. Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good.
We only reviewed my website, which was great. I feel like I got all of the insight, support, ideas, suggestions, etc. And it was really helpful to go through the checklist as well. And I'll say we also talked about the importance of just a general awareness of this. In our group, we all come from small teams, smaller organizations. I work for JDC, but I'm a part of JDC Entwine, which is a department of about 30, so very small. We don't have a full-time person dedicated to this, or even a full-time person dedicated to the website, for example, that really knows the ins and outs of this kind of stuff. So awareness is a really great first step, and then figuring out how to rely on experts, because myself and no one around me is an expert in this necessarily. Yeah, very helpful. And thank you to both of my teammates in the breakout room for all of your thoughts and suggestions.
Oh,
Savannah, can I ask you, if you don't mind sharing, I mean, I would love to hear also from the other group, but is there something specific that you sort of hadn't thought of, and that you now that you really think, oh, we should change that?
Yeah, I think so. I'll say most of this has been on our mind at Entwine, and we sort of in a piecemeal together way try to think of these things as we're looking at our website. I will say it has not been done holistically. So the idea of like twice a year or once a year, when you get to a really good spot, hopefully it's once a year doing a thorough review, that has not, to my knowledge, ever happened at JDC Entwine. So again, I think it depends on the web page. Some are better than others based on if they're a more active web page that we visit often, and it's sort of been a piecemealed approach. And we reviewed the JDC Entwine About Us page and just pulled out some really simple things that were like, oh, duh, this makes sense. This should be updated. And I will say one thing from the Bond website is the caption and photo credit. I really like the little eye that you hover over. It's very clean to have it kind of not hidden, because it shouldn't be hidden, but not take up visual real estate when you first arrive at the page. So that was one small thing that I'm like, great, let's figure out, it certainly won't be me, but let's figure out how to have our web folks that we outsource, how to have them support us in that. So yeah, and just many other really small things that, again, that annual or biannual review would probably catch in a far more holistic way than what we've been doing now, which is like we have the best intentions and we know a lot of this. Some of it's common sense, some of it's not, but how do we implement it holistically?
I mean, that's really helpful. I think it's helpful reflections for everyone else to hear anyway as well, just because similarly, lots of people are in the same boat with this. And it's intentions for me do count for a lot. Because I think if you're trying, then at least you're making steps in the right direction. And it's constantly making sure that that intention is there, because it's so easy when we're so busy. And, you know, in the grand scheme of things, sometimes people think, oh, doesn't really matter. But it really does when you think about this is the window to your organization that people are often the first thing they're going to see about you is your website. So you want to give the best impression of who you are, what you represent, but also your values as well. Like how you do things tells people about what kind of organization you are as well. So yeah, it's encouraging to hear that you guys are already thinking about this. But a lot of it's context specific. So one of the conversations that we were having was around, you know, if you're an organization where it's about volunteers going into countries and doing stuff, like how do you get around, you know, how the types of images that you're showing? And, you know, one of the things I was saying is we are as a sector asking questions about, well, who is it that should be doing that first response? You know, should it be local communities? But in some contexts that will work, in others it won't. So in a way, it's about, in a way, being explicit about why you're doing things the way that you're doing, I think is a good way of owning it, you know. So there's nothing wrong with saying the reason, you know, we have flown out X number of staff to this crisis because, you know, we're not in a position to be able to recruit locally because people are dealing with this on the ground. I think saying that is actually very useful and powerful, right? But also when you're using staff from local communities and they are at the forefront of your response, owning that and saying that that's how you're working is really important as well, because it shows that where you can give representation, you will, but there might be contexts where it just doesn't quite work. So I think that's a good way of maybe thinking about it. Any other thoughts and reflections? Do people feel this is a manageable and doable thing?
I'm happy to jump in here. It was something that we discussed. Sorry, my camera's off. My internet connectivity is just not great. But it was something that we actually spoke about in our breakout room, about how a lot of these guidelines, while fantastic and important, do require generally a lot of intensive resources. And we were saying between us, like how many hats we each wear just within our own role. So adding in like this whole other layer of things, and especially in Israel where there's so few GDPR kind of guidelines and things don't have to be done from like a legal perspective, it's kind of easier to like keep pushing them to the side and like, well, we'll get to that soon. But it's definitely given me some food for thought, especially kind of as we get ready to launch our new website. So it's been really helpful. Thank you.
Excellent. Nice to hear that.
So
I mean,
sorry,
go for it.
To what Mariam was saying, and just a reminder that we offer the Aspire micro grant if you want to hire someone just to add caption, you know, just pages, go through the checklist. Hopefully we could support the capacity.
Yes, do use that as a resource. So I did that where I got one of our editors to go through all of our website pages, just change them, update them and edit language and just fix things. And I didn't need to do anything but just show them how to log in. That was literally it. And they just got on with it and did it. So if you've got a pot of funding that you can use to pay a freelancer to just crack on with things, that's such a brilliant resource to have. But also I sometimes think, if you can't necessarily retrospectively fix things, then what about thinking, well, everything from now going forwards, we're going to start trying to do it like this, because you're going to be doing that work anyway. So why not just add in some ways of working or processes just to help you get to the standard that you sort of want to meet? Yeah, don't wait for the law to change. Do it because it's the right thing to do in a way, if you can. I know these things are difficult and they do take capacity and resource, but use the stuff that's free and available.
I'll also jump in to say on top of what Miriam just said. When this is to do very specifically with accessibility, not everything else that we've spoken about. But when you're because sorry, you just mentioned building a website. When you're building a website, if you follow accessibility laws really do end up equaling a good website, meaning because they have to do with, like Maria mentioned, jargon. So you don't want to use jargon so that your website will be more accessible to people, also people who have language processing issues, but also everyone else. And that is one small piece of what we spoke about, but I can tell you, because I've done this, been through this process twice, that it actually, they are one and the same. A good website really is an accessible website, and vice versa. So for whatever that's worth, keeping that in mind when you're building, or as Miriam said, starting from here. If not from scratch, starting from here.
Yeah.
Miriam or anyone else, I'm wondering if anyone has any recommendations for a consultant or someone that you know that's done really great work in this space, however big or small of a project that might be, in the nonprofit space, in the Jewish nonprofit space, etc. I'm curious if you have any recommendations.
Well, I'm going to jump in and say Miriam is a good source. And other than that, Savannah, do you mean in general or for something specific?
Well, I was just thinking, I don't know necessarily the scope or scale, but to have someone, knowing that myself and my team have baseline knowledge, but to have someone come in and review the website holistically, provide recommendations, partner for the future, maybe annually, or I don't know. Just speaking off the cuff.
So again, I will say, Miriam, I think there are possibly one or two others, but what I really would recommend also is stick that question on the LinkedIn group. I think that could be a great resource for, like you said, the Jewish world, but also the NGO world in general.
Yeah, I agree. I think so. Often people that are, if you use a good website developer or a good editor, they'll be so tuned into working in that way, just regardless of lots of different types of work. And the way, I think this is the reason why I've always got an eye for it, because I'm constantly looking at content. Right, hello, my cat's going to say hello. Hello. Were you feeling lonely? Here we go. Or you're finding this really interesting. Do you care about website ethics? Apparently you do. But I think if you've got somebody that's always thinking in that way, then they will inevitably be able to just spot things really quickly, because they say it's like a good editor. They can spot a typo a mile off. It's hard when you're doing your own editing of your own stuff, but when you're looking at somebody else's, suddenly everything's so obvious. But it's the same with accessibility as well. Like when you're really used to thinking and working in that way, and often editors, designers are, or freelancers. I've got a bank of them that I use on a regular basis, so I'm more than happy to recommend somebody as well. But yeah, they're attuned to working in that way, so they will constantly be looking for the things that often people get wrong, or ways that people aren't adhering to like legislation, because they just have to do it. So yeah.
I'll just, sorry.
Just a quick question, is that okay? I'm just curious about all of this, the whole change in the way we talk about this work is very much being done in English. There's people in the US, the UK, whatever, talking about this, being very sensitive about the words they use. What is your experience of, I know a lot of our partners have websites in other languages, Hebrew, Spanish, or whatever. Do you see that this is happening in other languages, and how do you make it, kind of equally ethical in other languations?
That's such a good question. So our language guide, actually, we worked on it with this organization called Compiler Initiative. So they do lots of work working with local organisations, looking at representation and language. So it's interesting, they are thinking about it and talking about it. But it's in a different way. So for example, I did a session with MSF in Canada, and they brought in all of their colleagues from around the world. And one of the things that came up over and over again is, and I heard it actually today, in the field. And when you think about what that actually means in practice, it's like, that's just, in the field, like what field? And who are we talking about? And who's in the field? It's sort of, it has colonial connotations. Let's just own it, right? And if we haven't thought about it, then we haven't thought about it, but it just does. But it's so extensively used by partners in countries as well. So then you just think, okay, well, there's this question around, there's lots of questions around just different languages and translating things, and things not working in different languages when you translate them, and sometimes meaning something different. So it's so contextual, it's unbelievable, it just is. So you sort of have to have, this is sort of our general baseline, but then you need to make it work for your organization within your context. I remember getting feedback that, I can't remember which word it was, but they basically just said, like, within our country context, because we have such a authoritarian government, if we started using language like that, we would be shut down, And if you look at the Oxfam language guide, where they took a very stern approach when it came to gender, I would say we haven't landed where we are on gender language yet. So I would be reluctant to go in a particular direction, but I think it's important to acknowledge that this conversation's happening. So, so you've got to be mindful of context. You're completely spot on. And if your partners are saying this just won't work, you have to listen to them, because ultimately they're the ones that are living and breathing this on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, and also this should be partner-led. That's the whole thing that we're really kind of pushing for, that this isn't us being classic colonial top-down. It's we're hearing that you don't really like the way we represent, the work that we do. We're hearing that you find us quite, overpowering and domineering, and you don't like the fact that we're always taking resources away from you, right? There's space suddenly for them to say these things, and that space should always have been there, but now it exists. We've got to listen to it and actually address it. So yeah, I don't know whether that really answers your question, but basically context specific, and be guided by your partners on the ground, because they know really what the realities are.
On that note, I am looking at the time, so I am going to, I'll just say one thing. I actually can recommend an accessibility tool, but I want to remind everyone, if you get a consultant to work with you on the entire gamut of ethical communication, that includes a whole lot of other issues that Miriam touched upon today, and you have to be sure that it's someone who's in line with your organization's thinking. So just that's something to be aware of. As far as an accessibility tool that does the trick, which is also something that Olam's microgrant would pay for, I can recommend that. You can write to me and/or Savannah if you ask that question in the LinkedIn group. I will note it. I just want to, remember microgrants, they can be used for this and for another topic. And also, if this is something that you want to continue a conversation about, please join our peer groups. Allison, if you wouldn't mind just sticking in the link to the peer group in the chat, and also to our next webinar if it's about climate resilience. And you can already sign up, early bird special. And on that note, I really, really want to thank Miriam. This was so insightful and helpful, and I, was part of preparing for it, and feel that I learned so much. So thank.
Oh no, Naomi's frozen.
I can finish that thought for her. Just thank you so much for your time. Thanks for everyone who joined, and we will follow with all the links and everything, and hope to continue this conversation. So great seeing everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you for giving me your afternoons. It's been a real pleasure. Take care, everyone, and drop me a note if you need anything as well.